Mr. Navalny was a very effective campaigner, and what's so extraordinary about his funeral was the way he managed to get the crowd out and get the crowd supporting him yet again. Even in death, he was a leader, with people in the street shouting, "Putin is a killer." Why don't we listen to that for a moment, because that sets the tone. Effectively, Mr. Navalny upstaged Mr. Putin. It's not that surprising that Putin did everything to stop the funeral taking place the day before, when he had his big speech. But even lying in an open casket covered with flowers, Mr. Navalny was a force to be reckoned with, and I'm sure Putin in his fridge is trembling next to the frozen peas. Had he been alive, I think Navalny would have been wryly smiling. Had he been alive, I think Putin would have been quaking in his boots. And, it's not just... It seems to go through the whole family. Lyudmila Navalnaya is clearly a force to be reckoned with, isn't she? And the Kremlin's defiance in refusing to hand over her son's body, the difficulty in finding a church that would agree to carry out the funeral. It's outrageous that under Patriarch Kirill, the sacraments are denied the people. Outrageous. Patriarch Kirill is not a churchman. He's a Kremlin stooge. I've seen the size of his cufflinks. I think the size of someone's cufflinks also a little bit like a large car. Mr. Putin's got a large car. Patriarch Kirill has got large cufflinks. We know what that means. And the fact that the funeral took place at all is because there is within Russia a sense of what is right and wrong, and the fact that Russia is suffering from an appalling autocracy, an appalling dictatorship, an appalling tyranny, despotism, and cronyism doesn't wipe out the fact that the majority of Russians are good, honest, sound, intelligent, thoughtful people. When you get on a train or a bus in Russia, you don't have that sort of empty silence that you often get in a bus or a train in Britain, or the sound of ridiculous music. You look around and everybody's reading Dostoevsky or Bulgakov or something interesting. The occasional person looking at Pushkin. People are doing things, people are reading, people are actively involved in an inner life in Russia. Is that inner life which is so important. When you go to Russian houses and you see these grey buildings built by with the names of various past leaders of the Soviet Union, and you go through these grey corridors, and then you and there's generally one long corridor. There's some doors, and then there's what's described as a private corridor, which is often seen as something very similar to the private bit of land that surrounds a dacha. And if you have your dacha in the village, you would have seen. You still can see in some Russian villages people sitting outside the dacha, talking, and that's sort of semi-public land. And that semi-public space is in that area, in that second corridor, which would lead to 2 or 3 flats. And you'd sometimes find people's bikes and so on parked inside that second corridor, because it's semi-private. It's not quite private. It's not quite public. Um, and and then you open the door, and you go from this grey world into this incredibly colourful, hospitable, often vodka-soaked, domestic environment. It's very welcoming, and it's very warm. Partly because the central heating in Moscow remains central. These big pipes go across the road, and the heating is pumped through those. So you can't turn your heating down or up. The heating is dictated by the central bureau. But yesterday, these large crowds of people who, when asked on television, what brought you here? I just felt it was right to be here. I don't agree with Mr. Navalny and so on. People were very careful to qualify their presence. But in the end, the thing that meant Putin had to allow that thing, the funeral, to take place, was the appeal to orthodoxy, something that he wants to embrace. He wants to be seen as the orthodox dictator, the Orthodox Tsar, and part of that is that orthodoxy is free at the point of use. And Navalny was a proud, patriotic Russian, and there should have been no thought about denying his body the obsequies that were his due. And to push him back into the outskirts of Marino, the crowds would come. The crowds did come. First outside the church, and then to the nearby cemetery. And the live stream on Friday, hosted by Navalny's team on YouTube, attracted an audience of 250,000 people on a regular, so over 6 hours. And I think the funeral was not a protest rally. The funeral was a genuine religious experience, but it was also a political statement. You could hear people calling out, Navalny, you weren't afraid, neither are we. Russia will be free. And in the afternoon, later on in the event, you could hear people calling out no to war. Ordinary people in Russia, particularly younger people, want a Russia without a dictatorship, without injustice, without war. And Navalny's organizations were not toxic, were not extremist, whatever Putin may have said. And I find, even now, I find the thought that his wife Yulia, his children Daria and Zaka, were denied the right to attend their father's funeral, to attend. Yulia denied the right to be with her husband in death, at his death and at his coffin. Outrageous behaviour by a crackpot tyrant living in the freezer compartment of the Smeg fridge. It's shocking, really shocking. When Putin and his cronies, they don't speak the language of law. They don't speak the name of Navalny. These two things are almost synonymous now. And that silence is pregnant with meaning. silence can speak. And Mr. Putin has made it very clear. He disregards the law. He disregards ordinary Russians. And this funeral was a statement. You know, even in the darkest times, with threats to people who gather, threats articulated yesterday by his spokesman, people were not silenced. People were not forced back at home. People came out, and students, civil servants were ordered not to attend. People were given warnings by the police, and yet they couldn't stop that crowd. School children from a school nearby could be heard shouting Navalny. And there were senior figures who attended. The Yevgeny Roizman, the former mayor of Ekaterinburg, also a vocal Putin critic. I think Boris Nadezhdin was also there. I'm not sure. I've seen reports which suggest that he was there. Boris Nadezhdin. I always get his name. I always pronounce his name wrongly. Nadezhdin. There has to be a D in there. Nadezhdin. That's it. Nadezhdin. And but yes, Navalny had the last word. Navalny spoke from the grave, and with the sounds of My Way, with the chords of Terminator 2, he's definitely not gone. He will be back.